Hello everyone, this is Rajesh Sengupta and we are continuing our discussion on woodblock making and printing. So as part of this discussion, we were talking about the distinctions between different woodblock making and printing practices in India, and we have already sort of spoken about the geometricity or like the inclination towards vegetal and creeper motifs. Those are observed in different parts of the Indian printed fabrics. Now let us look into a bit of this unique case what Kalamkari observed in the historical times. So in the left side of the screen we have detail from a rumal or a kerchief that was made in the mid 18th century, specifically 1737, because we have a date stamp on this rumal or this kerchief which justifies this dating. And then what we see is that this was something that was produced in the Coromandel coast. It was for the Armenian market, and in which we see how the printing has been done. So first we have the outlines which are printed, and the outlines seem to be printed with mordant, perhaps with the hint of iron based solution, and that's the reason it kind of got this brownish tone. And then we also have this blood red which is here in the flowers and other places. So the thing is that after printing the outlines, then perhaps the areas which are then covered in other colors, for example this red and green, these areas were printed. So there are two kinds of blocks which are used. So one is called the outline blocks, and then the other ones are called ghad or the filling blocks. So the filling blocks are used once the outlines are done. So we can imagine that the areas that we see here, which are perhaps in red, and also like of course that this area which had turned kind of greenish, so this areas might have also been printed in yellow. So either before or after the next process, and then once this printing had been done with the outline and one layer of modern printing, and then it went for indigo dyeing. So for indigo dyeing, as we have seen in ajrak printing, we have this indigo dyeing that takes place perhaps during the printing processes. So first we see the resist is printed, then the black color, then the mordant, and this sort of continues one after another. But for Kalamkari, what happened in this case that first the outlines and the mordanting had been done. It is boiled in the dye solution to achieve this dark outlines with some of the fillings in red perhaps, and then the entire thing was covered with wax. Now, and leaving the areas which are intended to be blue. So this is here in the right side of the screen we have some documentation of this wax resist drawing. So this is the kind of practice in which in Kalamkari we have a combination of both printing and hand drawing together. And this is a resist drawing that is continued, and the resist is also done very much in line with the outlines which are already created by this modern printing. So for example, if we need to have this areas in the bodies of this bird motifs here in the Gandaberunda, or like in the fabrics or in these birds there in this border, if these are the areas which need to be dyed in indigo, then the rest of the areas around these forms are then covered with wax, and this is the process in which wax is applied on these fabrics. And this is documentation during making of the 1961 census of India, and so presumably all this documentation have been done in the 1950s, where we see that there were certain communities which is also the community identity and all those aspects are documented in the census as well, where we see that the Toddy Tapper communities, the Muslims, and few other communities from the coastal Andhra Pradesh and especially women would engage in doing this wax resist drawing on fabrics, on these printed fabrics. So here we have some of these documentations of them, and then they would use this three-legged table for putting these fabrics, and one side will be slightly tapered, and where they can put the hand and then sort of make the drawings, and then slowly push this fabric, or like pull the fabric actually, and then do the drawing in the rest of the areas. So this is how the fabric and this resist drawing would continue. So it is not really the resist is printed directly on the fabric, but on the printed fabric the resist is hand drawn. So it's a different kind of combination we are talking about, even though in the final result this might not be distinguishable in the first go, but with keen observation one can see that how this indigo had been vat dyed. So for indigo to achieve this particular kind of depth, this dark shades of indigo in these fabrics, one needs to do them vat dyeing. Without vat dyeing, if it is directly printed on the fabric with the usual fructose fermentation process, then this kind of depth is usually not achieved, even though there are contesting theories about that. So this is something we find that to be like very distinctive in the kalamkari making practices. And this particular tool, this wax drawing column, which we will also touch upon that in the next week or the module as well, and we have spoken about that briefly in the first part of this course as well. And so this particular kind of column is also something we see as a regional innovation, and something which was in practice at least until 1980s, but then now this practice has completely been discontinued in coastal Andhra. So here, as we see that how this historical example tells us about how in kalamkari we have a combination of modern printing as well as resist drawing. So this is something that tells us about the specificity of this practice in this region, something that is not really seen in the other parts of India. And that also tells us about the what we can learn from these historical examples, not only in terms of the practice of the past or understanding the situation of this practice today, but also it expands the scope of experimentations. It's not just for the researchers and historians and textile scholars to understand this this parameters of the practice, but also to engage in the hands-on experimentation and see that how far we can also use this kind of historical resources for the present day practices. Now let us look little more into the history of the early printed fabrics from the Indian subcontinent, and perhaps some of the early groups of printed fragments we find, they are from this city or the site of Fustat, which is very close to the city of Cairo in Egypt. So Egypt is one of the sites where we find that early trade between the coast of Gujarat and part of like Middle East, they sort of continued, and Egypt was one of the places where the Gujarati merchants would go and deliver fabrics, and from there they will get the goods and then bring them back to perhaps to the Indian subcontinent and elsewhere. And through this trade, what we find that a lot of this block printed fabrics have ended up in this site, and during excavation we find that how a large group of this printed fabric samples were found, and that expanded our ideas about what kind of fabrics the Indian subcontinent produced, and a lot of this Fustat fragments are actually from the time frame of 9th to 15th century, from this broad time period, and a lot of them have been radiocarbon dated, and from there the dating had been also confirmed that what time period we are talking about for this fabrics. Now what happens in this fabrics we find in which are found from Fustat is that the ones we see here, these are the ones which are usually these are the ones like, I mean, this group of fabrics, these are from 13th to 14th centuries, and one can see that the ones which are there in the upper tier, they are all resist printed. So that means, like, I mean, this is one simple way of printing, perhaps, in which, like, I mean, the block is used with resist material, it is printed on the fabric, and then the fabric was immersed in indigo vat, and that is how this dark indigo color has been achieved. And then the areas which were already resisted, they retained the color of the fabric, the original color of the fabric, and that is how we find that the images are executed in kind of in this negative form, and then, like, the background had turned dark. So this is something we can also imagine that what we have already mentioned, that the practice of resist printing and dyeing that has been continuing in part of Western India, be it Ajrak or the printing practices in Rajasthan and other parts of Gujarat. So there we see certain traces of this kind of practices for sure. Then in the lower register we have different kinds of practice, I mean, different kind of printing, and in one we see in the left side we see that how resist material which is used, but this is much more finer compared to perhaps the ones we see in the upper register, and that is used, and then it is printed in, it is developed in red. So that means, like, I mean, after using resist we have and of course there are also hints of indigo printing there, I mean indigo as well. So we can imagine, like, I mean, how this can also be thought as a way in which Ajrak is printed, in which, like, modern and resist, they kind of come together. Or it can also be possible that, I mean, this fabric is only developed in madder or some form of red producing dye stuff, but then the indigo is perhaps added later on as well. Now the thing is that, I mean, what we see, I mean, presumably in this one indigo is printed. However, I just wanted to expand the ideas in which indigo is also added later at one point, and that is also found in certain fabrics, not only just from the Fustat fragments but also from the later examples as well. And then in the central one we see that how this is only modern printed, something that we also find in the other parts of the subcontinent, in which only one color is printed on this fabric, and that has the outline as well as some areas which are the feelings. And then in the lower right we have this one piece of fabric, and this is perhaps very different from the other ones that we have on screen, because this is most probably not block printed, but this is hand painted. So here we find that perhaps that whatever kind of, like, I mean, material that is used for making the resist, perhaps some form of wax or some kind of a flowy drawing material, resist material that is used, for which, like, I mean, all those flowy lines are created in resist, and then it is developed in both indigo and red, which is very close to, I mean, the color scheme looks very similar to the way in which Ajrak is developed. However, we can also see that, I mean, how this is entirely hand painted as opposed to the Ajrak printing that we have already discussed there. So these are the kind of ways in which we find that resist and then stencil, mordant, all these different form of processes were involved in making these printed fabrics. So when we talk about wooden blocks, we are not just considering that wooden block to be the only object for making these impressions, but then different kind of stencils can be used. In some forms we also see that how pieces of paper and other resist materials are used for blocking certain areas for printing and printing on the rest of the areas. So different simple tools and improvisations are also done in combination with the wooden blocks or the wood and metal blocks in this regard. For example, the one we see at the center, this has really fine lines, and one can still imagine, and even like this ones, the way in which we have this fine lines, one can still imagine that whether these lines are created with wood blocks or if there were metal that was involved here as well. The other thing that we have here is also this large painted fabrics, and I'm sorry, some of them are painted, some of them are printed, and in both cases we find that there are certain forms of repetition. So as I have mentioned, that there are large stencils or templates which are used. In some cases we definitely see that large printing has also been done. It is not necessary that for a large printing piece it is the only single block that is used for printing. A lot of times the entire image is divided into segments, and then the segments are kind of coordinated, and then one thing is printed after another, and that is how the entire images, the large images, are created. Now some of those early examples we find them again from Gujarat, but then none of them are actually found in Gujarat. So those examples we find them mostly from 15th century onward, and those examples are found in parts of Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia. And one of the examples we have here on screen, this was also something that was created for the Indonesian market by the Gujarati artisans, and in which we find that how resist is used for of course for making the forms, the figures and the ornamentations, but then it is also indigo dyed and modern dyed. So all these processes are involved here, whereas in the this areas where the borders are something that we can see the precision of this repetition that is there in this continuous border here, as well as this broad border on top. The same we can say at bottom here as well. These ones are most probably block printed, whereas in this cases there might be a combination of printing as well as hand resist drawing. So those are the ways in which we can find that it is not really always distinctive that only printing will be done or painting will be done, but in a lot of times a combination of printing, painting, use of resist and of course use of stencil and templates are done at the same time. And this kind of fabrics, we find them that they were made in this large pieces of fabric. Those were mostly perhaps ceremonial fabrics or made for certain kind of ritualistic purposes. So in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, we have this one fabric like this, in which there are those printed images of this kind of celestial dancers or apsaras, and it is assumed that this is perhaps made for the Jain festivals, for example the Paryushama or other Jain festivals, and perhaps they were transported to part of Southeast Asia with the Jain merchants who traveled from Western India to Southeast Asia, and a lot of them had their settlements there as well. So it is not uncommon that they carried these fabrics from one place to another as part of their rituals. And whereas we can understand that something that is more immobile, something that is heavy, something that is not always the most convenient thing to carry around, which they cannot really take them with them when they're seafaring. But then fabric is something, textile is something that can be folded, that can be placed within a box, and then it can be unfolded, and then once it is unfolded, it surrounds us. It kind of gives us this feeling of being in this temporary setup of this which can also be a reminder of the temple setup and other things which are there in their homes. So this is how textiles and these large pieces of textiles which are used for ritualistic purposes and so on can also be thought about, that they are not just there for the trade purposes, but they are also there for the trading communities, for certain kind of rituals or certain kind of practices that they followed. It is not always necessary that we think that, I mean, they are there as only trade goods which are there to be exchanged, but it can also be something that is used by the trading communities. Now, these fabrics, we also find them to be closely connected to the aesthetics that is there, that is prevalent in the a lot of this Jain manuscripts, and the Jain manuscripts that we have from Western India. For example, here on upper left we have one page from a Kalpasutra manuscript, and that is from Jaunpur Kalpasutra from 15th century, and also I wanted to kind of look into the manuscripts from the similar time frame, so to that we understand that how there are certain kind of visual arrangement, compositional setup, and use of patterns and motifs which have flowed in the manuscript painting tradition as well as textile making. So in one hand, perhaps, like, I mean, in the manuscript painting tradition, some form of templates and stencils are used for producing this images, but then the images are at the end they are hand painted. However, in terms of like the textile making, we see a lot of those images when the templates are used, they are also produced into wood blocks, or like, I mean, when they are also hand painted, then the stencils are used for making those repetitive motifs. So in this case, we find that it's not just the motifs which we can see to be closely related to one another, but also the color scheme in which we have the color of the matrix in terms of the color of the paper or color of the fabric that is utilized within the entire color scheme of this compositional setup, and then the resist and modern printing. So basic black, not black, I'm sorry, I mean basic red and indigo, and how we see that, I mean, those similar colors are also utilized in the manuscript painting traditions as well. So, and the kind of motifs that we find them to be there, it's not just that the motifs are just represented from one place to another, from one medium, for example, from paper to cloth or from cloth to paper, but there is also this contextual transmission that takes place. And that I say it's because that there are particular kind of motifs which are used for framing the textual panels that we have in the manuscript. There are kind of ways in which the visual scheme in the manuscript painting has been sort of arranged, in which there are registers, and then the ways in which, like, I mean, the figures are composed within these registers. So those are some of the setups. We also find them to be there in the central frame and in the borders. So the ways in which we see that the central frames are made in these textiles are something we can find them that they would have resonance with the central frame in the other mediatic expressions. But then in the borders, the kind of motifs we will find in one place, we will find that the resonance of those kind of borders in the borders of the textiles as well. So it is not really that sheepishly copying one motif and then replicating that to the other, but understanding the context in which certain motifs are used, and then very carefully and thoughtfully implementing them from one medium to another. So this is something we find that how these historical examples, they make us understand this kind of aspects of this intermediate transmission between textiles and different practices. And especially here we are talking about block making and block printing and its relationship to the other forms of visual practices. Now, when we get to the aspect of perhaps documentation or the historical examples of block making and block printing. So we see that from the colonial time period, as we see that this time period has been significant in terms of documentation of different forms of Indian textiles. So one of the most significant albums which were produced in the 19th century, in the later half of 19th century, which would have extensive documentation of block printed fabric samples, would be the one that is produced by John Forbes Watson. So John Forbes Watson's album, that is titled The Collections of Specimens from the Textile Manufacturers of India, that was published in and around 1874. We find that John Forbes Watson, who was essentially involved in the economic activities around textiles, so the trading activities and export of them, and making meticulous documentation of what kind of fabric that is produced, manufactured and exported from one side of India to the to perhaps to the rest of the world and different parts of the of Asia. So we see that of course it is not really by the Indian traders, but by the British East India Company. But the thing is that what we find there is that there is this extensive documentation of these samples. The small textile swatches were then pasted on this album with the details from where they are produced. So we do not really see here any details of how they are produced or which community were involved in producing them. So those documentations are completely removed from there. But then we have the information about what kind of material which is used here, and the site of producing them, and then also the measurement of the cloth and everything. Those are there from the original cloth from which these swatches were cut. So that says something about the ways in which the colonial officials and the colonial documentators have also functioned. And this is something that also says that why these printed fabrics were significant in this case. It's because that we have these printed fabrics which can be cut and pasted, because these are not as exclusive as the hand drawn fabrics. And that's the reason it is much more sort of convenient for people to have the yards of them, then cutting them into small pieces, putting them there in these swatches, in these albums, and then make extensive documentation of them. The same can be said that how Forbes Watson eventually would go on to make his this mobile or the portable museum set up, in which we see that there are there is this setup in which we have there are those frames in which extensive textile samples or these fragments which were collected from different parts of the Indian subcontinent would be put there with the details, and people can flip through them and can walk around them and see them all. This is something that was considered to be the first of one of a kind, this portable museum setup that came up in and around 1876, and it was displayed as part of this exhibition, that is the Imperial Museum and the Colonies. And here again I want to stress that this is also the materiality of the printed fabrics, that since it is produced in bulk, since it is not as exclusive as the hand drawn or something that is exquisitely woven fabric, so that's the reason it is much more convenient for the documentators to cut them into pieces, make them into swatches, and then display them for either for this portable setup or for the albums. Now this kind of documentations also come very useful for us to understand that which were the sites of production. So for example, here on screen we have two sites which were actively producing block printed fabrics. One is here in Machilipatnam or Machilipatnam that we have in the left side of the screen, and Machilipatnam is Machilipatnam is a site which is still producing printed fabrics, whereas here in the right side of the screen we have Fatehgarh, and that is from the northwestern province, which is today in Uttar Pradesh, and this site, which is very close to Farrukhabad, had stopped making this kind of block printed fabrics. So this kind of documentation also tells us about what kind of printing or like block making or textile making practices that were there in 19th century, and what had then completely stopped with different kind of reasons, primarily because of the colonial of course the subjugation of like different artisanal communities, but then also for different kind of issues also around ecology and then livelihood, the shifts in the choices of the artisans and etc. So these are some of the aspects in which we can understand the different parameters of the history of block printed fabrics and block making in the Indian subcontinent. We will continue the discussion with the focus on the southern block making and printing practices in the next part of the lecture. Thank you.